Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are getting into the conclusion of Peter David's Symbiote Spider-Man Alien Reality, which kind of feels like it should have been told over the course of 2 issues, but it wasn't, and probably because it's being followed by the King in Black, who knows. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so where we had left off, Peter and Doctor Strange had pretty much been bamboozled by the Red Cat when she claimed that she escaped and gave them the idea of going into the Nightmare Dimension to get the book, the Word of God, and correct this alternate reality. But like we had seen, this was a trick just to get them to enter into the Nightmare Dimension so that when they did, Mordo would do a spell that would freeze time, so that in reality where their bodies were, they could not physically wake up, which was pretty clever because it effectively makes them sleep forever. But in addition to that, Mordo then made sure that he would allow Doctor Strange to see the book be destroyed, which was like rubbing the wind in his face, but also giving him one last look at this alternate reality, letting him know that the book is now destroyed and there's no changing it back, which at this point effectively leaves them stuck in the Nightmare Dimension. And this leaves Nightmare to toy with them quite a bit because for him, in the case of Doctor Strange, like for him prior to this point, Strange has provided him with the most entertainment, quote unquote, as far as challenging Nightmare all the way to this point. But in the case of Strange, like he's feeling totally defeated. He doesn't have his magic, the book's destroyed, and they kind of have this moment to where they're like, the book's called the Word of God, like how could it be destroyed with it being quote of God? And Nightmare quickly corrects this idea because it's of God doesn't mean it's indestructible. Because really you could say anything is of God or from God, but even still that doesn't mean it cannot be destroyed, and this book really is no exception. But on top of this, you get your Symbiote Spider-Man moment when the symbiote takes over, and it kind of has you thinking, is this Peter, is it not Peter, which has been a reoccurring thing throughout this series. But when Nightmare tells them that you guys are completely subject to the rules of this dimension, like get that through your head, Symbiote Spider-Man then swings on him because he's not keen to the idea of being a tool of Nightmare's amusement until the end of time. But then it's also here where some of the rules start to come into play, because it's here where Strange then shares more of what Mordo had allowed him to see, which was within this alternate reality, Mordo had made sure that the Word of God, like the book, had never been written by writing it out of the history of this reality. And Spider-Man's like, oh, like a retcon. And Doctor Strange like, what's that? And I kind of find it hard to believe that Doctor Strange, of all people, doesn't know what a retcon is. But Spider-Man then goes on to explain, like your definition, retroactive continuity, which we've talked about on this channel a number of times. Either when a character or a series is rebooted and things are changed differently from how they had originally been. But Peter then goes on to reveal even more with pointing out that even with every retcon, that they're always unreliable. Like people always remember parts or portions of how things were, which is kind of how memories work. They're not in a straight line, but instead, like when you remember things, you remember them scattered at different points in time. And for the record, like in the case of Nightmare, if you're wondering why he's allowing this conversation to happen, it's essentially because his dimension is in danger. Because with Mordo in control of actual reality, like if he destroys it or stops people from dreaming, for example, then the dream dimension first and the Nightmare dimension would no longer exist, because both of them stem off of reality itself, with the dream dimension being created by the collective unconscious, becoming the first splinter on this branch of reality, which then had splintered off again into your Nightmare dimension. And it's essentially how it works when one reality splinters off of another. It creates a dependency on one hand, but also the idea of a cycle. But the thought of a cycle, this sparks an idea for Symbiote Spider-Man, because even though at this point the book, the Word of God, was physically destroyed, and also Mordo had made sure that no one had physically wrote it, but even still, before anything's physically created, it first starts in the imagination of mankind, and within infinite imagination, somewhere it's still there. But even further than that, Peter then points out, like anything that's created in reality, whether it's an invention or a movement, it starts off as a dream before it's made real. And with them being in the Nightmare dimension, which is also connected to the dream dimension, they are literally at ground zero for imagination and finding a way to tap into reality. But then on top of that, because they're in a dream state, and in your dream state, you're effectively in your astral form, Peter then proposes the idea of using one of the meditations which Strange had taught him, where you reach out and connect to another astral form, which in this case is all of humanity. And when Peter does it, he starts to disappear, and Strange is kind of like more or less like, well, that's unexpected. But it did kind of make me think of an instance where this happened on a much smaller scale. Because in Strange Tales issue 110, we had seen Strange go into his astral form and then enter directly into someone else's dream. dream, which we visit in and out of as we sleep, but clearly the dude, he didn't need to be there because the dude then woke up and he was like, you know what, I'm about to shoot Doctor Strange while he in my dream. But that same method, it's basically what Strange has sent Peter to do here. And as soon as he disappears, Nightmare goes along with him. And with going with Peter, he's acting just like a guide of sorts, but also making sure that Peter doesn't screw this up because once again, Nightmare Realm in jeopardy. But it's also here where we see that it gets a bit tricky, because with diving into this psychedelic pool of different consciousnesses or subconscious of all humanity, it's a super tricky thing to do, because effectively the plan is to reach within the minds of everyone and collectively gather the pieces, which would be the word of God. But when you're reaching through everyone throughout the world, not only do people have different opinions on who is God, but then there's also those who know a version of the truth because that truth is what they've been told their whole lives. But along this journey, it's this part where they travel to the human imagination, and Nightmare makes it clear that he realizes that he's talking to the symbiote and not Peter Parker. Which very much makes this like symbiote inception, because the symbiote's only allowed to dream because it's bonded with Peter Parker. But with Nightmare realizing this and addressing the symbiote, and almost like a little devil on his shoulder, because he lets him know with helping him find the pieces of the word of God, he can then not only fix reality and practically make himself a god, but then also perpetually place everyone in a nightmare state, which will then give Nightmare exactly what he's always wanted. But after proposing this idea within the imagination, Nightmare then shows the symbiote specifically what he needs to collect, which are the pieces of the previous reality that are still fragmented within the imagination of everyone in the world. And after identifying these pieces, the symbiote then forms them back into the book, the Word of God. And Nightmare tells the symbiote like to piece all this together, give it form, and give yourself a little something too. But even with this, we don't get like a deeper look into the origin of the Word of God, like who it originated from. Was it the one above all? Is it Kevin Feige? Like we don't know. And Peter David doesn't get too specific with it. But even with this happening, the book reappears right where it was destroyed, and out from the book jumps Symbiote Spider-Man, which at this time is still your consciousness of the symbiote. But with the way that this plays out, like it very much feels like it was supposed to be like a 6-part series, because how it draws to a conclusion, like everything wraps up pretty quick here. Because initially, Symbiote Spider-Man, he hops out, he's like, I'm a god now, I put the book back together. He goes for Hobgoblin, and Red Cat is just like, I bet, I'm out. And the symbiote is stopped by Mordo, who uses the light of the eye of Agamotto, and he lets him know like Agamotto sees who you truly are and it rejects you. But even still at this point, I feel like a lot of it is just really rushed. Because for one, the symbiote becoming a symbiote god, and it could have been stretched out into a lot more, and even if for a brief moment only in Symbiote Spider-Man. But even in this instance, it's like a quick moment, and then we find out like while they were scuffling, Doctor Strange had came through the book, and he had stopped Hobgoblin, who was gonna kill Symbiote Spider-Man and Peter while Mordo had him down. And like just in the nick of time, Doctor Strange is like, well, I used the book, I fixed reality, and everything outside of here is back to normal. And at this point, I'm just kind of like, really? Like, the rest of the story was just so good. But that's not it. Because after that, when Mordo was like, okay, we're gonna have to face off between the top 2 apprentices of the Ancient One. Like, this is what it's come down to, even on an even playing field. But that doesn't happen either, because Wong, he just comes through and hits Mordo on the head with some symbols, and that's it. But I just can't help but to think, like, with the way that this was concluded, like Peter David wanted to do more, or perhaps he had even planned to do more, because the first 4 issues were fire. But then we get to issue 5, and it just kind of feels like the story is going at like 2x, 3x speed. And just like that, it's over. But just as it wraps up, Peter does come back to his consciousness, and when he does, he doesn't remember anything about the Nightmare Realm, let alone piecing back together the Word of God, or how they got back here in the Sanctum Sanctorum, which we know is the work of the symbiote, hence the title, Symbiote Spider-Man, Alien Reality. But all this really does in the conversation here is just bring Strange to the point of asking Peter, like, how much does he actually know about the symbiote? And more or less, that's where it leaves off. And aside from showing us Natasha Romanoff, who's at a movie theater, once everything was fixed back to normal and she's not exactly sure how she got there. But even still, I gotta say, like, with it ending like this, like, I absolutely don't mind the ending going back to normal, because it's supposed to, or at least it seems that way for the most part. But I do gotta say, I wish it went a little bit further and took its time playing out the pieces, that it happened so quickly back to back to back at the very end. But even with that said, I do feel like the movie that Natasha Romanoff is watching, that's titled North, I do feel like it's a bit of a subtle hint to something that may have changed within the symbiote moving forward, which hopefully we'll see in the next installment of Symbiote Spider-Man, which we'll get once we get into The King in Black. because essentially the movie North was about a kid who was neglected by his parents and then got advice from this other dude who was like, emancipate yourself from your parents. And I could totally see that playing out in a way between Knull, the symbiote, and Nightmare. But we'll see if that translates over, if at all, very soon. And so now before we go, I want to give a special shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below, so you can head to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. And in spite of the abrupt conclusion to Symbiote Spider-Man Alien Reality, I'm still excited for Symbiote Spider-Man The King in Black, because I've been happy with everything else that Peter David has done within this series returning so far. And I'm pretty anxious to find out like how and where Kang the Conqueror and the Watcher are going to fit into the continuation of this series. But even with going back and the retelling of these stories, I do kind of wonder if anybody's going to tell the Watcher to watch out for Original Sin. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.